My name is George Nafziger. Live in Cincinnati, Ohio. Doctorate in military history, retired naval officer.
And I'm Vince Rospond. I'm the publisher of Winged Hussar Publishing. And our focus is primarily Eastern European history and mostly military history. This is the book. It's the Cossack War Against Poland, 1648 to 1651. And it was originally written by a Frenchman who witnessed the events and then several years afterwards wrote his account and dedicated it to the French court. And George found it and translated it from French into English. From there, and published it several years ago. How many years ago did you publish?
2 maybe.
2 years ago. Subsequent to that, just recently, George and I have gone into an arrangement where I'm going to start taking some of the books he's published and re-edit them slightly and get them out there in the wider marketplace. So this is the first volume of one of those efforts.
My understanding is he was very interested in it. He'd heard about it. He'd been in that area. He was meeting people in the court of Poland, as I recall, and he saw an opportunity to share his experience with the French people, writing it in French, of course.
And the thing to keep in mind, too, is there was a very strong connection between the French court and the Polish court. And by Poland, I mean Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, during this period.
I think it's a one-time thing. I found no other works by this author. So it's a one-shot affair, and it was something unusual, and he felt to share it.
What you should keep in mind, though, is during this period, without a popular press, books like this were common in other countries as well as a way to disseminate information about events. A lot of times they were done several years after the fact, and a lot of times they may not have been totally accurate either. But this one is fairly clear.
But it needs to be understood that this is in the early days where people were publishing books for people to read rather than church literature and such. This is where people would write books for people to read out of interest, and books were starting to become cheap because of offset printing and all that business was becoming more and more common. So this is in the early ages of what we have today as a massive literature industry, publishing books and such. Early days. There are not many books that you can find published in this period on any subject. So it's in the early stages of what we know today. The book was published in 1667, so about 16 years after the wars ended. He was in Poland. I have the impression he was involved with a lot of the people and spoke with many of them, but it was after the fact that he was hearing about it because it was still a subject of great interest and such. It's not impossible that he was part of an embassy, though he doesn't say that. It's very difficult sometimes to determine what has these people in these countries at this point. They don't always, in the dedication or whatever, indicate clearly why they were there. I found no other books by him. My efforts to identify who he was have been unsuccessful. I know absolutely nothing about him. Although he was literate, so that means he was the upper class. I have read some books published by soldiers from this period, and I'm going to say a junior officer and probably a noble class. We're really talking, anybody at this time was reading was either church or nobility. But there's no indication what his background is. It's unlikely that he was a businessman, a commercial trader or anything like that. So that's why I'm inclined to believe he was there on some sort of official capacity with the French government.
It's the story of Clemensky's rebellion and the events going back and forth on what happened between the Cossacks and the Polish government, the efforts that were made to try and ameliorate between the two sides, and how things broke down between them as well. In some ways, it is a little bit like a novel because there are some good guys and bad guys clearly defined in there. You could tell there's a lot of heroic action because he describes the battles, some battles that take place. He tries to describe the places they take place, and this is the one part where it gets difficult because in the original translation, his spelling of people's names and places.
They're creative.
Yeah, they don't if you read it out as it was written, it's very difficult to figure out what it was. So one of the things I did was try to pin down the ones that I knew and get the spellings down so people could understand who he was talking about, because some of them are just way off. You know who they are once you do a little bit of research, but it was difficult to pin that down. So, I mean, he's got all the major characters and the places. It's just spelling and grammar for it was a little bit, and plus, being French, he was trying to transliterate what he thought was Polish and Ukrainian words into French, and there was no standardization. For the most part, it's a pretty straightforward account. Obviously, there's a lot of what I would say heroic action, but it's never over the top. I've seen accounts of different things, other periods where they really go all out. But it seems like he stuck more to the facts than creating a lot of excess information in there.
Paul, translating from French, and we're talking pre-standardized French into modern English, is an interesting experience. You need to understand that we work with dictionaries today, and we have standard spellings and standard grammar. This book was published in 1661. It was only in 1635 that Cardinal Richelieu had established the Académie Française in France, which had the objective of standardizing the spellings of words, standardizing the meanings of words, and standardizing the grammar. The grammar, basically, I would read and then restructure completely, because the grammar is not even in modern French terms. It just required a tremendous amount of work to make it comprehensible. They tend to write sentences that are 2 or 3 paragraphs long. It's fun. They like semicolons and colons instead of periods. And there's oftentimes the issue of that they would not reintroduce the character by name at the beginning of a paragraph, so you have to go back and figure out who they're talking about when they start a sentence out with he. Spellings, they're very phonetic, and it takes a familiarity with the language. And I would read the word, pronounce it, and listen to it with my French ear to try and figure out what the modern spelling is. Accents. He knew there should be an accent in a word, but there are 3 of them, so he would just randomly pick whichever one he liked. So it was quite a trip translating. And there were even words. And when I said that Richelieu had the meanings of words standardized, there were a couple places in here where I encountered a word, and even looking in a dictionary that I've got for 14th to 16th century French vocabulary, I couldn't find it. I had no clue what it was. Between a creative spelling and it could have been a provincial term or whatever, I don't know. I would have to read the paragraph before and the paragraph after, and then between the language issues and my military background and such, my understanding of military history, give it my best guess is what this one word would mean. I even had a friend who taught French at the Air Force Academy in Colorado, and I'd say, hey, Cliff, what is this word? Would you know what this is? I have no clue what it means. Here's the whole paragraph. And he would have no idea. So we're dealing in a place where language was in flux. It wasn't standardized. And you just have to give it your best guess.
I mean, one of the things I will say, too, is because I do work in translating things from Polish, Old Polish and German, and even words 100, 150 years ago have a slightly different meaning now in military terms, and it's just trying to hunt it down. And he's done an excellent job trying to figure it all out.
Well, military was a little simpler than that. Yeah. This is not an academic work. There are no references to anything. He didn't even mention the names of the people he talked to from where he got the information. So it's devoid of any, what do you want to call it, academic frills.
It looks like he's condensed some of the events in the book. But, I mean, for the most part, it was very concise as far as the time frame he was talking about. But as an overview of what happened, it would be considered yes. Now, I when we were originally looking at this, I tried to see what other sources I could find as far as books on this period from this same time period. And there were, as far as books, I couldn't find a whole lot there. I mean, it's obviously during the rebellion, there are letters and there are accounts, but not as such an overview as this. And there are histories written afterwards, but they are written way after the fact.
If I may, you asked about sources. I've done some research. I probably found this volume on the French Bibliothèque Nationale's website. And I went back and I started doing searches on words to identify if there was more stuff on Ukraine or Poland or Cossacks and such. And there's very, very, very little literature before 1800. I mean, those search terms produce nothing. I even looked up Anne of Kiev, who, if I remember right, was married to Henry IV of France. And there was almost nothing on her. So there was no way to search back through that to find other relevant material. I also have a 4-volume bibliographical military bibliography by Pohl, I think it is, a German. And there was nothing on Ukraine, and the section on Poland had maybe 4 pages and very, very little on this period, nothing that I could see, but they're in Latin, they're in Polish, they're in German, and they're in French, and very, very few titles. So this is primary material, quite frankly. I mean, we were almost looking at the first book, may easily be the first book on the subject.
It's definitely a resource for people doing work on this as a starting point, because you can compare this against other later histories, and see how much they jive, maybe using it to confirm information that arrived later.
I think, though, and I don't want to sound like a salesman, but this is very near first-hand account. He was interviewing the people that were involved. In order to get any better, you'd literally have to get into the Polish court documents, into their archives, and look at that sort of, I mean, this is just the step beyond that. And in my many researches in the books I've had published, oftentimes I've found when I'm reading one source and looking 4 and 5 other sources, they frequently are referring to one original source and then giving variations on it. Well, I think this probably falls down into the one original source that everybody would subsequently spin out of.
And the thing to keep in mind, any documents or books from the period of the Hetmanate or the rebellion in the Ukraine during this period would have probably be published in Lvov rather than Moscow, and I think some of those documents probably would have been lost during the war. So this may be one of our few links to that period. It is interesting in descriptions of the battles that between the Ukrainians and the Poles, or the Cossacks and the Poles in this era. Some of his descriptions of the main base at Zeebrugge were a little odd, because I don't think he got his geography right. He obviously is taking that from secondhand sources, but he's almost good as far as every other source I've ever read on that area. But he has a couple of things I think are a little wrong there, but for the most part he's straight on. So from that standpoint, I was quite impressed with the even-handedness of the way he did the narrative. Yeah, I think for the most part it's a fairly accurate account of what happened during this period. And it, obviously is a turbulent time, and depending the sources you read later on, they can be portraying one side or the other as a bad guy or good guy or whatever. This is a very even-handed account, and this is, I think, a fairly accurate portrayal of what was going on back and forth. I mean, it shows how the king tried to negotiate a peace, and the nobles sort of undid him, and then at the same time how Khmelnytsky was trying to work with the king, and how some people within his sphere undermine him in certain cases. So from that standpoint, I think it is a very good account of it. If you get a chance, check out the book. I think it's, like I said, I think it's very well translated. It's a great source. George has a website of a lot of books like this. And George, you want to talk about?
I've, for probably about 15 years now, taken to translating obscure books. Being a military historian, after 10 books on Waterloo, I've read enough. I want to read something unique and different. And I search through the various online libraries and find stuff in French that is lost to the English military history readership, and translate it So 1 minute I'm translating an invasion of the Normans in England, and then right now in the thralls of translating a first-hand account of the 1683 siege of Vienna, and just kind of bounce around and enjoy the mysteries of lost history. But I produce about 450 books that I sell constantly online, and pure military history from about 900, the Arab invasion of Spain, to formally classified documents on the war in Vietnam. So broad spectrum.
And then Wingtusser Publishing, which I run, is, as I said, our primary ethos is trying to get information about Eastern European history, specifically military history, out. And we try and cover areas that aren't covered. Well, this whole area is not covered very well in English. So we're trying to make it available to people. But we are finding books all the time. Yep. He has to go for a second. We are finding books all the time, and we are looking, in obscure places to try and find them, from the French, the German, Polish, and Ukrainian, and to make them available. George has a list. One, he's got the...
Published about 1590. Zamonsky, the Tartars versus the Turks. Published in somewhere around 1600. It's on the list of stuff to be translated. Like I say, I find something obscure tickles my fancy, so off to the races.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And if there's any other questions, feel free to get a hold of us. Thanks very much, Bill. We appreciate it.